Good day, Miss. I am Cesare Marbas, and I am here in front of you to tackle about the part 2 and part 4 of CM 121. So first is the part 2, which is the requirements of vessels upon entry from foreign ports. Section 7, vessels to be inspected. All vessels coming from foreign are subjected to quarantine inspection upon entry in any port of the Philippines. Vessels cleared in one port in the Philippines are deemed cleared for all other ports in the country except in cases of any vessel with an infectious disease subject to the regulation emerging disease, public health emergency of international concern, and or death on board. So it is subjected to all vessels from foreign port coming in the Philippines and have to examine first for the safety of all personnel in a Philippines port to be aware of any diseases coming from any country. Section 8 requirements for vessels to be inspected. Any vessel coming from foreign ports subject to quarantine inspection shall be considered in quarantine until a given pratik. So, pratik means permission granted to a ship to have dealings with the port, given after quarantine on showing a clean bill of health. So, such vessel shall fly a yellow flag at its foremast upon entry into the harbor and wait for the quarantine medical officer. During inclement weather condition, a proper shelter or leave should be afforded to the quarantine boarding officer before the boarding formality can be conducted in cases of extreme weather condition. The boarding formality could be held in abeyance until such condition would be favorable. So in this section, it is the requirements for vessel to be inspected. The foreign vessel must quarantine first and have to wait for the quarantine medical officer to be inspected for a safety measure. Section 9. The requirements from the master of vessels to be inspected. The master of the vessels shall provide the quarantine medical officer the following duly accomplished documents. First is Maritime Declaration of Health. Second, Derating Exemption Certificate. Third, Passenger and Crew List. Fourth, Voyage Memo or Ports of Call. Fifth, Clinical Record of cases treated during the voyage, if any. And lastly, number 6, other documents deemed necessary by the quarantine medical officer for the compliance of health organization. So the master of any vessel on which a case or suspected case on an infectious disease subject to the regulations, emerging disease exists under a public health emergency of international concern exists, board shall as soon as practicable notify the Bureau of Quarantine at the next port of call or station and shall take such measures to prevent the spread of the disease of the Bureau directs. So in this section, we kind of from the word requirements, so it's all about requirements on how the master of the vessel should be inspected or what he or she should show to the quarantine medical officers in order for the uh, fast inspections in their vessels. Section 10. Kinds of pratik or clearance issued to incoming vessels. So there are 5 kinds of pratik. First, the free pratik. Second, the provisional pratik. Third, the controlled free pratik. Fourth, radio pratik. And 5, the controlled radio pratik. So we're going to tackle first the free pratik. So free pratik issued to a vessel which has complied with the quarantine rules and regulations as provided in this IRR. So, free pratik means that the permission was granted to a ship to a ship or vessel, or they are having a clean bill of health, or ensure the vessel is safe. So next is the provisional pratik. It means that it is given to a ship or vessel to serve as a proof that the vessel is free from any contagious diseases. And next is the controlled free pratik. So it means that permission was granted to vessels with a request for a direct berthing privilege submitted within 48 hours prior to the estimated time of arrival. The port is fully controlled, like there is no death port is like there is no death on board during the voyage, no sick person in the vessel, and there has been no death or illness to captive animals and bird, and the derating exemption certificate is valid. So next is the Radio Pratik, a pratik granted to military vessels of the Republic of the Philippines and foreign countries. So it means that as the new system involves the use of a wireless message certifying to state of health on board the incoming vessels, and pratik is granted wireless. So this is the tools that they're using um, in order to um, give the permission to be granted to those vessels who was inspected safe, or there is no suspicious diseases that was um, inspected. So next is the controlled radio pratik, a pratik granted to cruise vessels under the following condition. There should be a ship surgeon or physician on board. The request for controlled radiography shall be submitted to the Bureau within 48 hours before the estimated time of arrival. The port visited during the voyage shall be stated in the request that no infectious disease subject to the regulations, emerging disease and or public health emergency of international concern is present or endemic at ports of origin. There should be no actual or suspected case on board of an infectious disease subject to the regulations, emerging disease, or a public health emergency of international concern. And lastly, the quarantine medical personnel shall board the vessels at the anchorage and conduct quarantine inspection while the vessel is slowly proceeding towards the port. So controlled radiopratic, it means allowing ships to pass quarantine simply on the strength of a radio message from the ships of doctor. Section 11. Immunization Certificate Requirements. First, yellow fever. So the means of yellow fever, travelers arriving from the yellow fever infected areas are required to present valid international certificates of vaccination against yellow fever if arriving within 6 days from that area. The validity of the certification shall extend for a period of 10 years, beginning 10 days after the date of immunization or reimmunization. The yellow fever vaccination centers in the country accredited by the World Health Organization are Quarantine Central Office, Manila, Cebu Quarantine Station, and Davao Quarantine Station. The director of quarantine may from time to time prescribe or require immunization from certain diseases if in his declaration such requirements are essential on account of varying public health conditions. Other vaccinations may be administered upon request. So this means that um, Travelers have to um, show those requirements or show those immunization certificate showing that they are um, they are safe. So this is what we call the yellow fever, which is those areas who has a yellow fever. So I tell you, so as what I said earlier, that um, required to present valid international certificate of vaccinations. Mm. So that's why they have to present that requirement in order to the safety of the personnel of the port of the Philippines or the vessels from the Philippines. So they had to show that immunization certificate in order to have a safety port and a safety to have us to be aware of any kind of diseases coming from any country because we don't know that that country has a lot of fever, and if we don't examine them, so we Filipinos, we are um, we can adapt the diseases. Section 12: Extent and method of quarantine inspection. During the inspection of vessels, the quarantine medical officer shall check the following conditions before granting a pratique to the vessels. First is the state of health of the passengers and crew, existence or non-existence of an infectious disease subject to the regulations emerging disease, and or a public health emergency of international concern from the port of origin or other previous port of call. Third is sanitary conditions on board. Fourth, validity of the derating exemption certificate and state of rat life on board. And lastly, number five, type and tonnage of cargo. Section 13: Boarding of vessels from foreign ports placed under quarantine. So, in case of notification of the presence of suspected cases of infectious disease subject to the regulations, emerging disease, and or public health emergency of international concern or death on board. First is no person is allowed to embark except the quarantine medical officer and or his duly accredited assistants. Second, this embarkation of the passenger and crew is not allowed until such time that the vessel has been granted a quarantine clearance. Third, suspect cases shall be medically evaluated on board and transported to a designated referral hospital for isolation. Fourth, these remaining passengers and crew of vessels, if the need arises, should be medically evaluated on board the vessels. Fifth, crew and passengers who may be possibly exposed to an infectious disease, emerging disease, and or public health emergency of international concern may be isolated or undergo voluntarily home confinement or home quarantine. So this area, so if those people who are subjected that they are having that kind of diseases, so they are going to quarantine first. Like now we are like the COVID-19, like COVID-19, we are going to quarantine before we're going to enter in our area or in our place that we're living. Like if you are there in Dubai, so if you're going to travel here in the Philippines, you are going to um, travel. You are going to quarantine first um, um, in order for the safety of our nation. So so in boarding of vessels also those um, passengers or crew was inspected um, have that kind of infectious diseases, so they are going to have their quarantine first. So if they are um, um, not suspected in that kind of diseases, so they are what we call they have the free pratik, so they are free to come in our place or in the Philippines port. So that's what the boarding vessel. So that's what the section 13 means. Section 14, requirements of vessels before departure. So no vessel shall be allowed to depart from any seaport of the Philippines to foreign destination without securing an outgoing quarantine clearance from the Director of Quarantine or his duly authorized representative. This clearance shall be granted to the vessel on condition that such an a vessel has observed all quarantine requirements imposed. This clearance shall be requirements for the granting of a customs clearance for departure. So this is what means that the vessels, there is no vessels could enter to any seaport of the Philippines without securing of being quarantined. So they have to quarantine first before they can enter to the seaport of the Philippines. So that's what the section 14 means. Section 15, embarkation of travelers for international voyage. So the director of quarantine, when he considers it necessary, may order the medical examination of travelers and may disallow of any suspected person having an infectious disease subject to the regulations, emerging disease and or public health emergency of international concern from embarking on an international voyage, except in case of the transport of sick persons by a conveyance especially provided for the purpose in order to safeguard the health of the passengers and crew. So, so the director of quarantine should examine first those traveler from international um, crew or different kind of person in that vessels. They have to quarantine again for the safety of the passenger and crew, and also to the port of the Philippines. Section 16, personnel assigned for inspection. So in this area, so this is now um, who's who are those um, capable of this kind of inspection. So the quarantine inspection official shall be conducted by the quarantine medical officer and or duly accredited assistant designated by the director of quarantine. In seaport, where there is no quarantine medical officer, a duly trained physician will be designated by the Undersecretary of Health as acting or alternate quarantine medical officer upon the recommendation of the Director of Quarantine, who shall perform such function on an annual contractual basis. So we hear that those personnel that assigned for inspection is the quarantine medical officer. Um, but the seaport, there is no quarantine medical officer, so those trained physicians are are capable for those inspection, or they have to act it as alternate quarantine medical officer that they are recommended by the director of quarantine. So um, we can those personnel who is or are not recommended by the director of quarantine are only allowed for the inspection. For those who are not recommended, you they are not allowed to be inspected. Section 17. Time of vessel quarantine inspection. Inspection of vessels required by this regulation shall be made between 800 to 1,200 hour and 1,300 to 1,700 hour, Mondays to Fridays. Any inspection performed outside of these hours and during Saturdays, Sundays, and holidays shall be compensated for hence, reasonable reimbursement by the concerned shipping company may be allowed by the Director of Quarantine in relation to the incurred expenses and services rendered by each quarantine personnel. So there is a time for vessel quarantine inspection. So they have to follow this time of quarantine inspection. So you hear that earlier that between 800,000 to 1,200 hours and 1,300 to 1,700 hours, Mondays to Fridays only. Huh? So Mondays to Fridays. So um, during Saturdays and Sundays and holidays, so that is the time that um, that is the time that shall be compensated. So now let's proceed to the part 3, the requirements of domestic vessels. So section 18, vessels to be inspected. All domestic vessels plying domestic ports with the presence of infectious disease subject to the regulation, emerging disease, public health emergency, or international concern and or death on board are subject to quarantine inspection and clearance. In ports where there are no quarantine officials, clearance of these vessels will be coordinated with the local health authorities. Section 19. Requirements for vessels to be inspected. Domestic vessels subject to inspection shall be considered in quarantine until properly declared, cleared. Such vessel shall fly a yellow flag at its foremast upon entry into the harbor, drop its anchor at the quarantine anchorage, put down its accommodation ladder, and wait for the quarantine medical officer. During inclement weather conditions, a proper shelter or lee should be afforded to the quarantine boarding officer before the boarding formality can be conducted. In cases of extreme weather condition, the boarding formality could be held in abeyance until such condition would be favorable. Section 20. Requirements from the master of vessels to be inspected. The master of the vessel shall provide the quarantine medical officer the following duly accomplished documents. First is the clinical record of treated cases during the voyage of or the incident report of the death on board. Second, the rating exemption certificate. Third, passenger and crew list. Fourth, voyage memo ports or call. Fifth, other documents deemed necessary by the quarantine medical officer for the compliance of the health regulation based on the guidelines of or protocol promulgated by the Bureau of Quarantine. So, um, so those following are the duly accomplished document that the master of the vessel should have to present. So next is the master of inter-island domestic vessel on which a case or suspected case of an infectious disease subject to the regulation, emerging disease and or public health emergency of international concern exists on board shall as soon as practicable notify the Bureau of Quarantine at the next port of call or station and shall take such measures to prevent the spread of the disease of the Bureau directs. The ship captain may be ordered to muster the crew and passengers on board in a well-lighted and ventilated place for inspection when deemed necessary. The deck officer, the deck officer in charge of health, or the ship surgeon or physician shall provide the quarantine medical officer the medical data of crew or passengers. He shall assist the quarantine medical officer to the sick bay or cabin to examine any patient and review his clinical records for evaluation and management. Section 21. Immunization requirements. The director of quarantine may from time to time prescribe or require immunization from certain diseases if in his direction such requirements are essential on account of varying public health conditions. So the director of quarantine should always, I mean, so the director of quarantine should always um, um, required for immunization time to time should check all the um, crew or the travelers to check the required immunization for the safety of the seaport. Section 23. Extent and method of quarantine inspection. During the inspection of vessels, the quarantine medical officer shall check the following conditions. First, the state of health of the passengers and crew. Second, existence or non-existence of an infectious disease subject to the regulations, emerging disease and or public health emergency of international concern, outbreak of international concern from the port of origin or other previous ports of call. Third, sanitary conditions on board. Fourth, validity of the derating exemption certificate and state of a rat life on board. And fifth, the type of tonnage of cargo. So this is the method, extent and method of quarantine inspections. Section 23. Personnel assigned for inspections of inter-island vessels. The quarantine inspection of vessels shall be conducted by the quarantine medical officer and a duly accredited or assistant designated by the director of quarantine. In port where there is no quarantine medical officer, a duly trained physician will be designated by the Undersecretary of Health as acting or alternate quarantine medical officer upon the recommendation of the Director of Quarantine, who shall perform such function on an annual contractual basis. So that's the personnel that been assigned for the inspection of inter-island vessel. Section 24. Boarding of domestic vessel placed under quarantine. So in case of notification of the presence of suspected cases of infectious disease, subject to the regulation emerging disease and or public health emergency of international concern and or death on board. First, No person is allowed to embark except the quarantine medical officer and or his duty accredited assistants. Second, this embarkation of the passengers and crew is not allowed until such time that the vessel has been granted a quarantine clearance. Suspect cases shall be medically evaluated on board and transported to a designated referral hospital for isolation. Fourth, the remaining passenger and crew of vessel, if the need arises, should be medically evaluated and on board the vessel. Fifth, crew and passengers who may be possibly exposed to an infectious disease or emerging disease and or public health emergency of international concern may be isolated or undergo voluntary home confinement or quarantine. And lastly, I six, any person who boarded a vessel under quarantine without a permission shall be subjected to detention and quarantine. In cases when the vessel exposed to radiological, biological, or chemical terrorism, the tailored action on such incidents should be followed in accordance to the interim guidelines on preparedness and response to the radiological, biological, and chemical or RBC incidents. So that's what the boarding of domestic vessel should be placed during their quarantine period or quarantine inspection. So now we are now down to the part 4, the requirements of vessels while in port. So section 25, requirements of vessels while in port. So route guards on mooring connection lines. If the vessel docks alongside the piers, all mooring lines shall be provided with prescribed rot guards not less than 1 meter in diameter and so fixed as to be always at right angle to the line to which it is attached. 2. Cargo net, gangway plank, and ramp. All cargo net should be hauled up when not in use. The gangway or plank and or ramp, forward and aft, shall be lifted up when not in operation and will lighted throughout the night to prevent the access of rodents. Third, distance of vessel from the dock. All vessels should bend of at least 1.5 meters from the dock. Fourth, mooring a vessel to another vessel which is moored to a dock. A vessel which shall tie alongside another vessel moored to a dock shall institute all necessary measures to prevent the access of rats from one vessel to another. So, so this is the requirements of vessel to a port. So they have to have a meter distance in order the rat should not um, go to that vessel. Section 26. Section 26. Disposal of garbage. No vessel shall be allowed to dump garbage or waste overboard while in the harbor. Garbage should be collected in prescribed containers for disposal. When a vessel is in port, arrangements should be made for the regular removal of garbage by a disposal service in accordance with the environmental and health provision on waste disposal to ensure that it is properly collected, treated, and disposed of in accordance with existing standard and laws. So the disposal of garbage. So it is um, it is duty that they have to collect those garbages in that vessel because um, if they're not going to collect it correctly, so that's the reason that um, there are a lot of diseases um, happen to that vessel. So and it is not right to put garbage um, or put waste overboard while in the harbor. So that's not right to put garbage in the sea or in any kind of place where the vessels are. So um, um, we have to, or they have to, collect the garbage properly and put it in the right um, disposal to be aware of any kind of diseases. So Section 27, Rat Inspection of Vessels. So, the following vessels shall be subject to rat inspection while in the harbor. First, vessel without derating exemption certificate. Vessels with expired derating exemption certificate. Vessels with valid derating exemption certificate but with moderate to heavy infestation aboard or have visited plug infected port. So, any inspection for rat infestation shall be under supervision of the quarantine medical officer, and all findings shall be recorded in the derating inspection form. Derating measures shall be conducted depending on the degree of rat infestation, and a corresponding certificate will be issued. So there are also kinds of derating certificate. There are three kinds of derating certificate. So first is the derating certificate, a certificate being issued after a derating measure has been performed, such as fumigation or rat poisoning and trapping, which is valid for 6 months from the date of issuance. Second, Second is derating exemption certificate, a certificate being issued when there is no evidence of rat infestation on board and is valid for 6 months from the date issuance. Third, extension certificate, a certificate being issued with which shall be valid for 1 month from the date of issuance, with instruction that formal inspection and issuance of a derating exemption certificate shall be done in the next port authorized to conduct such inspection and issuance of certificate. The certificate can only be issued once. All vessels must have a valid derating certificate or an extension certificate upon arrival and prior to departure. So, in this section, rat inspection of vessels. So, they have to inspect um, if there is a rat in that vessel. So, they have to use different kinds of poisonous that can kill um, the rat to be aware of any kind of damage in that vessel, like the rat can cause they're going to bite we're going to cut any wire in the vessel, so that can cause um, damage or that can cause danger. So also rat um, can damage to any kind of goods or any kind of good that has the vessel. So they have to inspect a vessel if there is a rat in order for the safety um, of the personnel. And lastly, section 28, the fumigation. The following are subject to fumigation while in the harbor. Any vessel with human or rodent plague on board. Any vessel moderate or heavily infested with rats or other pests and vermin. Cargoes in a vessel from a plague-infected port which are vulnerable to harbor and rats and fleas. However, if the cargo is covered by a valid certificate of fumigation from the port of loading, the fumigation may be waived subject to the verification of the authenticity of the certification. Inter-island vessels for their periodic annual fumigation. So, fumigation also means that it is a target treatment technique commonly used by pest management professional to effectively control pests that attack stored goods and commodities. So that's all for today, ma'am. So that's what part two and part four of our discussion. So thank you for listening. Keep safe and God bless. Bye bye.